Visual novels are a very interesting medium and subgenre of video games. Unlike video games, which have plenty of official publishers and popularity, allowing people to basically have almost all games originally from Japan have something in English these days, visual novels are an unfortunate case where, despite there being quite a good amount of well-liked translated visual novels as of 2023, we're still very lacking of them in a way. Consider how many potential untranslated visual novels people may like that may either have a translation in progress or have no translation projects announced at all. In this video, I want to go over some potential reasons why I believe visual novels are relatively lacking in terms of why we don't get translations as much as other mediums and why we don't get more at a faster rate. The first thing I want to bring up is how much text there is in basically every visual novel. As consumers of visual novels, we probably love and probably take for granted the fact that there's such a variable length among visual novels, with stuff as short as Sayano Uta or as long as Fullmetal Daemon Muramasa, both by the same developer no less. However, try to think of this from a translator's perspective. Even if you're the biggest fanboy or fangirl of visual novels, the fact of the matter is, if you just want to translate a visual novel of relative average length, it's still a pretty good amount of text. Let's use JPDB and compare the lengths of 4 visual novels of varying length. Planetarian, a relatively short visual novel at less than 10 hours, has 27,000 words. Making Lovers, roughly in the 30-hour range, has 297,000 words. Fate Stay Night, a visual novel that's at least 50 to 70 hours, has 763,000 words. Rants 10, a gameplay visual novel and considered both the highest rated but also longest visual novel ever in Japan, has 1,246,000 words. Pretty easy to see how this can be daunting just on the translation front, even for shorter visual novels. The second thing I want to bring up is the fact that there's actually more to releasing a translated visual novel besides just translating. Translating is merely the first or one of the first things you have to take into account when starting a project or keeping track of a project as a fan. After the translation aspect is done, you still have to go through the editing process, which includes things like making sure terms are consistently translated throughout, drastically reducing the amount of grammatical errors and consistencies, and just keeping the tone and tense relatively the same. Some translation projects try to opt for a translation checker or TLC, which is basically a person who can double check the actual translation to make sure things are actually translated correctly, or make sure just things aren't missing. One of the most underrated and possibly actually most important parts of visual novel translations are the programmer hackers. It's one thing to translate the text, it's another to actually try to get the text into the game itself. From what I've heard of visual novel hackers, it's not always as easy as it seems. Some visual novel engines are just really unique and weird, and have sometimes been the sole cause of why translations have been delayed or even cancelled. Finally, there's QC, aka quality control, or testing. Once the translation, editing, and programming is done, someone still has to go out of their way to read the whole visual novel from start to finish, and make sure there's no bugs when reading the visual novel, whether they're the text itself, or making sure the graphics show correctly, making sure things line up, etc. And that's not even getting into the whole sales and marketing thing. So basically, just getting a translator is not enough to get a visual novel translation. Just finding available people good at all of these roles that I just listed and able to stick through them to the end, especially for a fan translation project, may be more difficult than you'd expect. The next thing I want to talk about is the relative lack of return of investment if you were to work on a visual novel translation project. As much as I love the visual novel medium, I won't deny it's still relatively niche for a reason. Even the most mainstream visual novel, Doki Doki Literature Club, is nowhere near close to representing the average popularity of most Japanese visual novels. This lack of investment relevant to popularity is a downside in 2 ways. If you're a fan translation group, you're 100% doing this for free. Unlike doing a fan translation for a manga or something, where you only have to do like 20 pages a week, visual novels, you have to do so much text as stated earlier. Many groups choose to not do partial patches because most people want to be able to experience the whole thing at once. That's just the nature of visual novel readers. Since fan translation is all about pure passion, these projects are basically only for some fame and goodwill, and are guaranteed to not gain you any money. It's understandable for one to not want to go through the task of going through at least half a year of doing a decently long visual novel, and that's only if they finish it. The other downside could arguably be worse when you consider official translations. Unlike fan translation groups, who very likely know the visual novel work they're doing, and that is one of the main reasons for even wanting to keep going through the project, there's not a guaranteed chance that the official translator gets a visual novel that end up liking or even knowing about. What's worse is when you consider things that apparently visual novel translators get paid a lot less than you would think, especially when you consider how much text there is. And then there's also the issue where some visual novel fans are particular about how their translations are, and many times official translations tend to get criticized because they don't fall under a particular set of style by the weeb community. Also, unlike fan translators, you tend to be on a deadline, so on one hand, you could get things done faster, but maybe things aren't translated the way you would have liked because you have to rush to get to the end in order to appease the original Japanese developers. When you consider this and the fact that there are so many other potential paid translation jobs out there, including but not limited to video games, possibly anime, or actual interpreting, there's no practical reason to want to stick to visual novels unless you just really like the medium. The next thing I want to talk about is just how humongous the backlog of visual novels that would have to be translated at this point. Even if we were to take the highest rated untranslated visual novels on VNDB or Arrow Gamescape and only translate those, there's still quite a lot of backlog to go through. And some of these visual novels are definitely not short. Whether you have a fan translation group with a lot of motivation, or you have an official publisher that can find a Japanese developer that would actually work with them, you still have to go through the process of having a full translation team, as mentioned earlier, go through each and every one of these well-liked visual novels, and not only get the translation correct in a way that most of the fans would like, but they would also have to take into account the return of investment, whether the publishers deem it would sell well, or the fan translation group likes it enough to stick through the project through the end. The next thing I want to bring up is working with the original Japanese developers. This problem can go in many different ways. The first and easiest to talk about is the fact that developers may simply cancel any potential fan translations. Let's say, for example, you wanted to translate an older Ubisoft title. Nekonian tends to only translate their newer titles, so in order to keep up with their contract with Ubisoft, they would have to go out of their way to stop fan translations of any Ubisoft title that aren't pre-approved. So if you wanted to do a fan translation you would think a company wouldn't translate sooner, there's a high chance that another company, usually a publisher, will stop that translation if you wanted to complete it. Some companies apparently refuse to allow translations overseas for whatever reason. The biggest example I can think of is Illusionsoft, who had some of the most popular Edo game in the West for nearly a decade and a half, but refused to make official international versions, citing piracy apparently. It took them basically forever to release the overpriced and lacking in content VR Kanojo as a test case, and then they were surprised when it made money. Now they're currently raking it in with the popularity of Koikatsu Party on Steam. But they potentially lost Western sales during the period when stuff like Artificial Academy 2, Honey Select, and pretty much the entirety of their back catalog was being fan translation and shared freely across the internet. This is quite unfortunate, as there's a really good contrast of a few visual novel Japanese developers that decide to publish their own visual novels such as Frontwing, Key, Poltop, and Laplacian and get their own translations for them. However, even these companies could be a little picky of what they choose what to translate and which not to translate. One thing I would consider a potentially overlooked point is machine translation. Machine translation is the idea of using some kind of computer automated program or AI to translate one language to another, so this removes the whole human touch to translating. Now, I know machine translation is almost basically a taboo word in the online visual novel community. There's many people who just refuse the idea of machine translations at all, generally citing the complications of translating Japanese to English. That said, there are also plenty of people who low-key read machine translations with a mindset that as long as it reads well enough, who cares, because they know they're not going to be Japanese experts. It might feel like a weird point to bring up machine translations at all, because you would think that people would want to only have good human translations. That is mostly true when you consider how things that have had very bad machine translations, like Your Diary, considered very unreadable, to the point that even the publisher put a note on Steam that the translation is not in a good spot. So then why bring this point up? Well, when you consider the factors I've already mentioned, like how hard it is to translate so many words, in theory, a machine translator that eventually got advanced enough to translate well enough where half the visual novel fanbase or more would accept machine translations could at least solve the issue of having so many visual novels to go through, and effectively removes one obstacle to go through, the translation aspect. All you would really need at that point is the hacker or programmer to extract text from the visual novel and then get the machine translator to translate the whole text and then be able to put that translated text back into the visual novel itself. Then maybe have an editor and tester just to make sure things are working just alright at a basic level. While I don't think even a great machine translator would fully replace a good human translator, it is possible for simpler genres like moege and nukige easily being covered, with only manual translations needed for plot visual novels or just visual novels that are harder to translate than most. The final and arguably most important reason is that visual novels as a whole sadly do not sell well at all, especially not on Steam. Even with some of the most well-rated, well-loved visual novels, many times their sequels, prequels or fan discs don't get translated simply because their original did not sell well at all. This also may be a reason why some companies have stopped giving publishers the ability to translate even after they've done multiple visual novels from them. Based on what I've heard, some visual novels developers will only agree to translate a visual novel if they expect to get a really high amount of return of money. One of the biggest examples was Baldur's Sky, where Sekai Project was able to translate it and without a Kickstarter, but the issue is that we weren't able to get more visual novels from Giga because apparently, despite it being decently popular, Baldur's Sky did not return nearly as well on revenue as they would have liked, so not only did Giga prevent future translations, but they ended up closing down as a developer in Japan themselves shortly after. How I personally noticed that once Sekai Project stopped doing visual novel translation Kickstarters as a regular thing, the visual novels they've been able to translate and release in the last few years are stuff not that many people are particularly interested in. But that's basically all Sekai Project was able to get financially. However, this goes even further to companies that are still alive. So for example, JAS recently translated the original Majite Wajishi ni Koi Shinasai, or Majikoi Love Me Seriously. Despite it doing decently well, Majikoi is very long and expensive visual novel to make, so if JAST wanted to translate Majikoi S and pay off all the voice actor bills, they would have needed a lot more sales to do that. But anyway, that wraps up many of the reasons I can think of why there aren't more visual novel translations. What are your opinions on the reasons that I brought up? And do you think there are any that I missed or I'm mistaken on? Feel free to leave a comment below.